The screen is black. A single dry crackle of a campfire is heard. The narrator's voice begins, low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. You ever hear a sound that's so wrong, it makes the hair on your arm stand up before your brain even knows why? It's not a gunshot. It's not a scream. It's the sound of something soft and heavy hitting a door in the dead of night. Not a knock, a fall, like a bag of grain, if that bag of grain had a soul and it had just given up. That's the sound Jonas McCready heard. And when you live as far out as he did, where the coyotes are your only neighbors, a sound like that doesn't mean a visitor. It means trouble has lost its way and ended up right on your doorstep. He pulled the door open with one hand, the other wrapped tight around the stock of a shotgun he hadn't fired in 10 years. He was expecting a drunk prospector, maybe a wounded animal. He wasn't ready for what he saw. A girl. Couldn't have been more than 18. Barefoot on the rough porch boards, her hair a wild tangle of blonde and dirt. She was wrapped in a single fine linen bedsheet, stained with things you don't want to think about. Her skin was a road map of bruises, a constellation of scratches, but it was her eyes that stopped the breath in his chest. They were vacant, empty. The eyes of an animal that's been chased so long, it's forgotten how to run and is just waiting for the teeth. Jonas didn't ask a single question. He just pulled the thick wool coat off the peg by the door and held it out. She stared at it for a long second, like she didn't understand what a gift was anymore. Then her hands, shaking like autumn leaves, reached out and pulled it around her shoulders. Her voice was a bare whisper, rough and cracked. "I'm not clean," she said. It wasn't an apology. It was a warning. Jonas didn't flinch. He didn't nod. He just turned and pointed a thumb toward the small tack room behind the main house, a place for saddles and grain, but it was warm and it was safe. She walked like her bones were made of glass, each step an agony. He poured her a cup of water from the well, his hands steady, and put a kettle on the stove without saying a word. Something told him this wasn't just a lost girl. This was a mess. The kind of mess made by a man with too much money and not enough soul. The kind of man who thinks the world belongs to him, and everyone in it is just something to be used. Jonas had seen that kind of man before. He'd fought them in muddy trenches across the sea. He'd faced them down in smoky saloons, and he'd buried friends because of them. He thought he'd left that life behind. He thought he'd found his peace out here, in the dust and the quiet. But as he looked at the trembling girl swallowing water like she'd crossed a desert, he had a sinking feeling. That fight hadn't ended. It had just followed him home. The sun was just cracking the horizon, painting the Arizona dirt in shades of orange and blood. Jonas sat on his porch, his boots up on the rail, the shotgun resting against the wall beside him. He still didn't know her name. He didn't need to, because whoever she was, someone was going to come looking for her, and he had a feeling they weren't going to ask nicely. The dog started barking before he even saw the dust. It was a low, guttural sound, not the bark they used for rabbits or snakes. This was the one they saved for men. He stood up, his hand resting on the stock of the shotgun, and watched the trail. A single rider coming hard, not meandering, not enjoying the morning. This was a man with a purpose. He rode a big black horse that ate up the ground, and he pulled it to a stop so hard the animal protested. The man himself was big, with a scar that cut a crooked line from his eyebrow to his jaw. The gun on his hip wasn't for show. The leather was worn smooth from use. "Saw a girl," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Blonde, barefoot, might be wearing a sheet." His eyes scanned the ranch, cold and assessing. Jonas squinted, not at the man, but at the rising sun behind him. "You lose your mind already today? Sun's barely up." The man didn't smile. He didn't even blink. "She belongs to Mr. Grayley. Ran off this morning. She's his wife now. Papers signed and sealed by the judge himself. I'm just here to bring her home." The words hung in the hot, dry air. Wife, belongs to. Jonas didn't say a thing. He just walked over to the well, slow and deliberate, and lowered the bucket. He pulled it up, hand over hand, the rope groaning in protest. He let the water splash over the side, a loud, deliberate sound in the sudden quiet. Then he turned, his eyes like chips of ice. "You see a scared girl in a sheet running through cactus and sharp rock in the middle of the night. You don't bring her home. You bring her help. That girl's got bruises on top of bruises. And the man she ran from ought to be ashamed to call himself anything but a coward. The writer's eyes narrowed. A flicker of something, maybe respect, maybe annoyance, crossed his face. You sure you want to be the man who stands between Mr. Grayley and his property? Jonas looked him dead on. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. I'm sure I ain't moving. There was a silence then, the kind of silence that comes right before lightning strikes. The rider's hand twitched, hovering just over the butt of his pistol. The dogs growled, a low rumble in their chests. Jonas didn't move a muscle. He just stood there, a mountain made of quiet resolve. But the man didn't draw. Instead, a slow, ugly smile spread across his face, the kind of smile that promised pain later. All right, old man, have it your way. He tipped his hat in a mocking gesture, turned his big horse around, and rode off, the hoofbeats a fading drum of war. Jonas watched him go, his jaw set like granite. When he stepped back into the tack room, the girl was standing. Her eyes weren't vacant anymore. They were fixed on him, sharp and questioning, trying to figure out what kind of man she'd stumbled into the arms of. He set a loaf of bread and a piece of cheese on the small crate beside her, then walked out. And as he reached the porch, he took down the old rifle from the hooks above the door, the one he hadn't touched in years, the one that had seen real war. Because men like Grayley, they don't send just one dog. They come back with the whole pack. The day passed in a tense, simmering quiet. The heat built, pressing down on the small ranch like a physical weight. Evelyn, she'd finally whispered her name when he'd brought her a fresh shirt and pants, stayed in the tack room, a prisoner by choice. She'd peek out the small, grimy window, her gaze fixed on the horizon, expecting to see a cloud of dust at any moment. Jonas worked. He mended a fence, his movements economical and sure. He sharpened an axe blade, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound for miles. He wasn't just doing chores. He was preparing. Every swing of the hammer, every turn of the whetstone was an act of defiance. Around midday, the tack room door creaked open. Evelyn stepped out into the blinding sun, squinting. She was wearing his old plaid shirt, the sleeves rolled up a dozen times. She walked over to the fence where he was working, her steps still hesitant, but no longer looking like she might shatter. She just stood there for a minute, watching him work. Can I help? She asked, her voice still quiet, but clearer now. Jonas didn't look up right away. He hammered one last nail into place with a single perfect stroke. Then he turned and handed her a small hammer from his tool belt. You know how to swing one of these? She shook her head. Well, he said, turning back to the fence, you're about to learn. It wasn't much, just a few crookedly hammered nails and a gate that still squeaked. But it was the first thing she had done in a long time that wasn't running or hiding or bracing for a blow. It was the first time she'd built something instead of being broken, and that meant more than he could ever say. Later, as the sun began its slow descent, they sat on the porch steps, sharing a plate of beans and bacon. They didn't talk much. They just watched the chickens scratch in the dirt and the dust devils dance in the distance. Finally, she pointed a trembling finger toward the horizon, toward the town that was just a smudge of smoke in the distance. You think he'll come back? Jonas didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on that same smudge of smoke. I'd bet my last boot on it, he said, his voice flat and certain. She nodded, as if she already knew the answer. But this time, she wasn't shaking. And Jonas noticed something else. Her hands, the ones that had trembled so violently just that morning, were now resting still in her lap. One of them was curled loosely around the handle of the small hammer she'd used. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was getting ready. And as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple, Jonas knew the peace was over. The storm was coming. They came just as the last sliver of sun bled out below the horizon. Not one rider this time. 3, kicking up a storm of dust that looked like a thundercloud rolling in low and fast. Jonas saw them from the porch. He didn't move, just placed his half-empty coffee cup on the rail and rested one hand on the stock of the rifle leaning against the doorframe. The air went still and tight, like a guitar string pulled to its breaking point. Inside, he could hear the faint click of the tack room door being barred. Evelyn was hidden, but she was listening. She knew it was him. The man in the center was Grayley. You could just tell. He was dressed in a fine black coat, too nice for a man so filthy on the inside. He sat on his horse like he was on a throne, a look of arrogant ownership on his face. The two men flanking him were the kind you hire when you don't want to get your own hands dirty. Big, dumb muscle, smelling of cheap whiskey and sweat. Grayley dismounted slowly, pulling off his leather gloves with a theatrical flourish, like he was the star of some grand play. He looked at Jonas, then at the small, neat ranch, and his lip curled in a sneer. "Heard you've been entertaining my wife, Macready." His voice was smooth but with an edge of rusted steel. Jonas didn't blink. He didn't even stand up. He just looked Grayley up and down, his gaze lingering on the man's expensive, polished boots. "Heard you've been beating what ain't yours to touch." The sneer on Grayley's face vanished, replaced by a flash of raw fury. The mask had slipped. "That girl is my property. The law says so. Papers signed. The town knows it. You're harboring a runaway." Jonas finally stood up, moving with a deliberate slowness that was more menacing than any sudden move. He stepped down off the porch, the worn wood groaning under his weight. He stopped just a few feet from Grayley. "The law don't mean squat when a man's got no honor, and a piece of paper don't give you the right to treat a human being like a dog." The goons moved first. They always do. The one on the left charged a clumsy, bullish rush. Jonas didn't even seem to move fast. He just pivoted, a neat, economical turn, and brought the heavy stock of the rifle around in a short, brutal arc. It connected with the man's jaw with a sickening crack. The man crumpled to the ground like a sack of wet sand, out cold. The other goon, seeing his friend go down, was smarter, or dumber, depending on how you look at it. He went for his gun, but he was fast, and Jonas was faster. The rifle was already at Jonas's shoulder. There was no shout, no warning, just a deafening roar that echoed across the valley in a puff of dust from the goon's chest. He staggered back, a look of profound surprise on his face, before collapsing in a heap. Grayley froze. His face had gone pale, his arrogant posture shrinking before Jonas's eyes. He was still holding his gloves, looking down at his two men, then back up at the smoking barrel of Jonas's rifle. All the money, all the power, all the lawyers and signed papers in the world didn't mean a thing out here, in the dirt, at the end of a gun. Jonas walked right up to him, so close Grayley could smell the gun smoke and the righteous anger rolling off him. "You listen to me, and you listen good," Jonas said, his voice a low, deadly whisper. "If I so much as see your shadow on this land again, I won't be aiming for your hired help. I'll be digging your grave right where you stand. Now get." Greeley didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The terror in his eyes said it all. He scrambled backward, fumbling for his horse's reins like a scared little boy. He hauled himself into the saddle and galloped away, not even looking back at the men he'd brought with him. As the sound of his horse faded into the night, the tack room door opened. Evelyn stepped out. Her face was pale in the moonlight, but her eyes weren't afraid anymore. They were burning. She looked at the two bodies in the dirt, then at Jonas, and for the first time since she had arrived, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. It was a smile of freedom. And Jonas, standing there with the heavy rifle in his hands, felt a familiar, long-forgotten weight settle on his shoulders, the weight of being a protector. But this time, he thought, maybe this time he could get it right. But the world doesn't work like that, does it? You can't just solve a problem with a single gunshot, especially not when the problem is a man like Grayley. Because men like that don't just have muscle, they have roots. Roots that run deep into the town, choking everything around them. Jonas knew that, but in the quiet month that followed, it was easy to forget. The days fell into a comfortable rhythm, mending fences, tending to the small vegetable patch, quiet meals on the porch as the sun went down. Evelyn started to come back to life. Color returned to her cheeks. She learned to cook on the old wood stove, filling the small cabin with the smell of fresh bread. She even laughed once, a real, unguarded laugh, when one of the chickens chased a grasshopper across the yard. In those moments, Jonas could almost believe they had won. He started to see her not as a victim he had to protect, but as a person, strong, resilient, a survivor. Then one morning the quiet shattered. She didn't come out for breakfast. Jonas waited, figuring she was just tired. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, a knot of unease tightened in his gut. He knocked on the tack room door. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. "Evelyn?" Silence. He pushed the door open. She was sitting on the edge of the cot, perfectly still, her hands pressed flat against her lower stomach. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a look he'd only ever seen once before, on the face of his own wife, years ago. A look of terrifying, undeniable truth. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, and in that one look, he understood everything. The beating, the escape, the consequences that don't just fade away with the bruises. He sat down on the crate beside her. The little room suddenly felt impossibly small, the air thick and heavy. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? He just sat there, listening to the buzz of a fly against the window pane, a sound of life in a room filled with the shadow of what was to come. Finally, her voice, small and broken, cut through the silence. "What do I do?" Jonas rubbed his calloused hands together, a habit he had when his thoughts were tangled. He looked out the window at the endless expanse of dry, unforgiving land. He could tell her to run. He could offer her money to go somewhere far away, where no one would know. That would be the easy thing, the safe thing. But Jonas hadn't taken the easy path yet, and he wasn't about to start now. He turned to her, his gaze steady and clear. "You let it live." She stared at him, her eyes filling with a disbelief that was more painful than her fear. "Even if it's his?" The word hung in the air between them, poisoned and ugly. "Even then?" she whispered. She was waiting for the disgust, the anger, the pity. She was waiting for him to push her away, to tell her she was tainted, that she had brought this filth into his home. But it never came. Instead, Jonas stood up slowly, his tall frame filling the doorway. "You ain't broken, Evelyn. You're just beginning again." "And that baby," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it, "that baby don't carry his sin. It only carries what you give it. Love, strength, a chance to be better than its father." And that's when she finally broke, not with a scream or a loud sob, but with a quiet, complete surrender. Her shoulders slumped and her face crumpled, and she leaned forward into his chest. And Jonas McCready, the man who had walled off his heart with stone and silence for a decade, wrapped his arms around her and held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. From that day on, there was no more hiding, no more whispering in the shadows. A week later, he hitched up the wagon and drove them both into town, right down the middle of Main Street. He sat beside her on the bench outside the general store. He nodded to the folks who stared and whispered behind their hands. And he bought baby blankets and a small wooden rattle from the same store Greeley practically owned. He was drawing a line in the sand right in the middle of Greeley's town, and he was daring anyone to cross it. The whispers followed them everywhere. But Jonas didn't care, because in a world where men threw people away like yesterday's trash, he had chosen to hold on. He had chosen to protect, not just her body, but her future, and her child's. He was standing against the storm, but he was still just one man, and the storm was getting bigger. What do you think makes a man truly strong? Is it the power he holds over others, or the protection he offers to the vulnerable? Let me know what you think in the comments below, because this story is far from over. The first real shot wasn't fired with a gun, it came in the mail. A crisp white envelope delivered by the circuit rider, addressed to Jonas McCready. Inside was a letter from the bank owned by Alistair Greeley's father. It was a foreclosure notice. The letter, polite and professional, explained that the loan his father had taken out 20 years ago, a loan he'd been paying on time, every time, was being called in full, due in 30 days. 30 days. It was a death sentence. There was no way he could pull that kind of money together. Not in a month, not in a year. Greeley wasn't just trying to run him off the land anymore. He was trying to crush him, to erase him, to make an example out of him. Jonas read the letter twice. his face unreadable. Then he folded it neatly, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and went back to splitting wood. But there was a new tension in the swing of his axe, a new violence in the way the blade bit into the logs. Evelyn found him later that day, standing by the corral, staring out at the land that was about to be ripped away from him. The land where he'd been born, the land where he'd buried his parents, his wife, and his daughter. "He's doing this because of me," she said, her voice heavy with guilt. "I should go. I'll ride out tonight. He'll leave you alone if I'm gone." Jonas didn't even turn to look at her. "No, but he'll take your home." This is just land," he said, finally turning to face her. He tapped his chest with 2 fingers. "Home is what you build inside, what you stand for. If I let him run you off, then this land ain't worth keeping anyway. It'd be as poisoned as he is." But his words, strong as they were, didn't change the facts. They were cornered, and Grayley was just getting started. The next Sunday, the preacher, a man whose salary was paid by the Grayley family tithe, delivered a sermon on the sins of adultery and the sanctity of marriage. He didn't use names, but he didn't have to. Every eye in that small church cut over to the empty pew where Jonas McCready used to sit. The town was turning. The whispers grew louder. People who used to nod to Jonas on the street now looked away. The blacksmith suddenly couldn't find the time to reshoe his horses. The man at the general store was suddenly out of the brand of flour Jonas always bought. They were being isolated, starved out, cut off from the world. It was a siege, slow and silent, but just as deadly as any army. Grelly was showing them that his power didn't just come from a gun. It came from the fear and dependency of an entire town. He owned their jobs, their homes, their very futures. And he was using that power to choke the life out of the one man who had dared to defy him. One evening, as they were eating a meager dinner of potatoes and onions, the last of their supplies, a rock smashed through the cabin window, showering the table with glass. Tied around it was a piece of paper. On it, a single word, scrawled in ugly, angry letters. "Whore." Evelyn flinched back as if she'd been struck. But Jonas didn't get angry. A cold, dangerous calm settled over him. He stood up, walked over to the shattered window, and looked out into the darkness. "They're getting bolder," he said, his voice low. "They think we're weak. They think we're scared." He turned back to her, his eyes finding hers in the dim lamplight. "They're wrong. The next morning he didn't mend fences. He didn't chop wood. He took the shotgun out into the yard along with a handful of empty bottles. He set them up on a fence post 50 yards away. Then he handed the gun to Evelyn. "What's this for?" she asked, her hands trembling as she took the heavy weapon. "He's not just coming for me anymore," Jonas said, his voice grim. "He's coming for you. And for the baby. You need to know how to stop him." Her first shot went wide, kicking up a cloud of dust 10 feet to the left of the bottles. The kick of the gun almost knocked her over, but she set her jaw, planted her feet, and tried again, and again, and again. All day the sound of shotgun blasts echoed across the valley, a declaration of war. They weren't hiding anymore. They weren't waiting. They were getting ready to fight back. Just when Jonas thought he knew the shape of his enemy, the world shifted under his feet. The rider with the scar, the one who'd first come to the ranch, showed up again. It was late, the moon a pale sliver in the sky. He didn't ride up bold and loud like before. He came on foot, a ghost in the darkness, materializing at the edge of the firelight like a bad omen. Jonas had the rifle on him before he'd taken 2 steps into the yard. "That's far enough," Jonas said, his voice a low growl. The man stopped, holding his hands up, palms out. He looked different than before. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked a lot like fear. "I ain't here for a fight, McCready," he said, his voice strained. "My name's Silas, Alistair Grayley. He's my brother." The words hung in the night air, more shocking than a gunshot. Brother. This wasn't just hired muscle. This was family. This was blood. It made everything more complicated and 100 times more dangerous. "What do you want, Silas?" Jonas asked, not lowering the rifle. "I came to warn you," Silas said, taking a hesitant step forward. "He's not right in the head. He's been this way since we were kids, but it's getting worse. The foreclosure, turning the town on you, that's just the start. He's talking about fire. He's talking about burning you out, leaving nothing but ashes. Jonas stared at him, trying to read the truth in his eyes. Was this a trick? A trap? Why are you telling me this? He's your brother. Silas looked down at the ground, kicking at a loose stone. Because what he did to that girl, it ain't right. And because this ain't the first time. There was another girl years ago, a servant at our father's house. She got pregnant. One day she was just gone. Alistair said she ran away. But I saw him the night before she disappeared. I saw him digging out by the old well on our property. He told me he was burying a sick dog. The story sent a chill down Jonas's spine that had nothing to do with the night air. This wasn't just about a brutal husband trying to reclaim his wife. This was about a monster, a man who threw away lives like they were nothing. He's not just going to run you out, McCready, Silas said, his eyes wide with a desperate sincerity. He's going to bury you, all of you. You have to leave. Take the girl and ride out tonight. Don't look back. Jonas finally lowered the rifle. He looked from Silas's terrified face toward the small cabin, where a single light burned in the window. He could run. He could take Evelyn and the unborn child and disappear into the territories. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as he stood there, he thought about the other girl, the one no one had stood up for, the one buried by the old well, and he thought about the promise he'd made to himself over the graves of his own wife and child, that he would never again stand by and let evil win just because it was easier. I'm not running, Jonas said, his voice quiet but absolute. But you've given me an idea. He looked Silas straight in the eye. If you really want to stop your brother, a warning isn't enough. I need proof. I need you to show me where he was digging. Silas's face went white. He'll kill me if he finds out. He'll kill us all if he doesn't, Jonas countered. You have a choice to make, Silas. Are you your brother's keeper, or are you going to help me stop him before he does it again? The choice hung between them, a terrifying weight. Silas stood there for a long moment, torn between blood loyalty and the desperate dawning realization that his brother was a killer. The fate of everyone involved rested on the next words out of his mouth. Finally, he gave a slow, terrified nod. All right, he whispered. I'll do it. But we have to go now. Tonight. A desperate plan began to form in Jonas's mind. A plan that was dangerous, reckless, and probably suicidal. But it was the only chance they had, not just to survive, but to see real justice done. The kind of justice that couldn't be bought or bullied. The kind that grew from the dark, cold ground. The ride to the Grayley estate was a journey into the heart of darkness. Jonas and Silas moved through the night like wraiths, sticking to the shadows, their horses' hooves muffled on the soft dirt. The Grayley ranch wasn't like Jonas's humble homestead. It was a fortress. A sprawling main house, huge barns, and fences that seemed to go on forever. It was a monument to wealth and power, built on the back of a terrified town. Silas led him around the back, to a grove of old, withered cottonwood trees near a dried-up well. The air here was colder, heavier. This is it, Silas whispered, his voice trembling. This is where I saw him. Jonas dismounted and lit a lantern, keeping the flame low. The ground was uneven, covered in years of dead leaves. He handed Silas a shovel from his saddlebag. Then start digging. The work was grim. The rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel was the only sound, a funereal beat in the oppressive silence. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of a distant owl made them both freeze, their hearts pounding in their chests. After what felt like an eternity, the shovel hit something with a dull thud. It wasn't rock, it was softer. With renewed urgency, they dug with their hands, pulling away the dirt. First, it was a piece of rotten fabric, then a small, delicate bone, a human hand. They had found her, the lost girl, the one who had no one to fight for her. Jonas felt a cold, hard rage solidify in his chest. This was the proof. This was Grayley's secret, buried in the dirt. But what could they do with it? The sheriff was in Grayley's pocket. The judge was his friend. In this town, Grayley was the law. As they were staring down at the shallow grave, a light flickered in the main house. A window high up. A figure was silhouetted against the glass. Grayly, he was awake. "We have to go," Silas hissed, grabbing Jonas's arm. "Now!" They hastily covered the grave, their minds racing. They had the proof, but it was worthless if they were caught and killed out here. They mounted their horses and rode, not back the way they came, but deeper into the darkness. As they rode, Jonas's mind was a whirlwind. The bones were not enough. He needed more. He needed something that would turn the entire town, something that would force the sheriff's hand, something that would strip away Grayle's power layer by layer until there was nothing left but the monster underneath. He turned to Silas. "Your brother, does he keep records? A ledger? A journal?" Silas thought for a moment. "He has a study in the main house. He keeps everything locked in a safe behind a painting of our father. Deeds, loans, records, everything. He calls it his book of power." Jonas pulled his horse to a stop. A new, even more insane plan was forming. "Take me there." "What? Are you crazy? We can't go in the house. He's there," Silas protested. "He's not expecting us," Jonas said, his voice low and intense. "He thinks he's safe. He thinks he's untouchable. That's his weakness. We have one chance to get that book. Tonight. While he thinks we're just a rancher and a scared girl, waiting for him to burn us out." It was a fool's mission, a desperate gamble with their lives as the prize. But Jonas knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was the only way. They couldn't outrun Grayley. They couldn't outgun his army of hired thugs. But maybe, just maybe, they could outsmart him. Maybe they could steal his power right out from under him and use it to burn his whole corrupt world to the ground. They turned their horses around and headed back toward the lion's den. Breaking into the Grayley house was like walking into a mausoleum. It was silent, opulent, and smelled of dust and secrets. Silas, trembling but resolute, led Jonas through a side entrance used by the staff, his knowledge of the house's layout their only guide. They moved like ghosts through the darkened halls, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors, whose eyes seemed to follow them. Every creak of the floorboards was a thunderclap, every tick of the grandfather clock a hammer blow to their nerves. They reached the study. It was a room drowning in dark wood and leather, the air thick with the smell of cigar smoke and arrogance. A massive portrait of Grayley's father hung on the far wall, his painted eyes filled with a cold, judgmental stare. "Behind that," Silas whispered, pointing. Jonas lifted the heavy painting off its hook, revealing a black iron safe embedded in the wall. It was old, complex, and utterly impenetrable. "I don't know the combination," Silas breathed, his face falling. "Only he does." It was over. They had come this far, risked everything, only to be stopped by a wall of steel. Jonas ran his hand over the cold metal of the safe, his mind racing. Then his eyes fell on the massive mahogany desk in the center of the room. It was neat, orderly, everything in its place. Except for one thing. A small silver tin of cigars left slightly ajar. On a hunch, Jonas walked over and picked it up. He sniffed it. An expensive brand. He looked at the bottom of the tin. Scratched into the metal, so faintly he almost missed it, was a series of numbers. It was too easy. Could it be? He walked back to the safe and began to turn the dial, his fingers surprisingly nimble. Left to the first number. Right. Past it to the second. Left to the third. A soft, satisfying click echoed in the silent room. The handle turned. The heavy door swung open. Inside, stacked neatly, were ledgers, deeds, and files. And on the top, a small, leather-bound journal. Jonas grabbed it and flipped it open. Grayley's handwriting was a precise, elegant script, a chilling contrast to the words he wrote. It was all there. Not just the details of the loan he'd used to trap Jonas, but dozens of others. A systematic conquest of the valley, ruining one family after another, buying their land for pennies on the dollar. And then, tucked in the back, Jonas found it. An entry from 5 years ago. "Maria, the girl is a problem. She grows bold with her belly. Father would be furious. Dealt with it tonight, by the old well. The dog is buried." It wasn't a confession. It was a business entry. A problem solved. The casual cruelty of it stole the breath from Jonas's lungs. This journal was Grayle's soul, laid bare. It was the proof he needed. It was dynamite. Just as he was about to close the book, he heard it. Footsteps, coming down the main staircase. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Greeley was awake, and he was coming this way. They were trapped. The study had only one door. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Silas's eyes were wide with panic. Jonas shoved the journal into his coat, his mind working faster than it had in years. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on the tall, thick velvet curtains covering the massive window behind the desk. The window, he mouthed to Silas. They scrambled behind the desk, pulling the heavy curtains around them just as the study door creaked open. A sliver of lamplight cut across the room. Jonas held his breath, the journal a lead weight against his chest. Through a tiny gap in the curtains, he could see Grayley. He was holding a lamp in one hand and a pistol in the other. He wasn't just checking on a noise. He was hunting. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on the open safe. A low, guttural growl escaped his lips. He knew. He knew someone was there. The lamplight moved slowly across the room, getting closer and closer to the curtains where they were hiding. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Jonas could hear his own heart pounding, a frantic drum against his ribs. He could see the dust motes dancing in the lamplight as it crept across the floor, closer and closer. Grayley was a predator in his own domain, sniffing the air, sensing their presence. The light washed over the curtains and stopped. Silence. Jonas braced himself, ready to fight, to die, but not to give up the journal. Then from somewhere outside, a dog started barking furiously. A commotion. Shouts from the bunkhouse. Grayley hesitated, torn. The disturbance outside was real, immediate. He cursed under his breath, turned, and strode out of the study, leaving the door ajar. He was going to check on the noise. This was their only chance. Jonas didn't wait. He grabbed Silas and they bolted. Out of the study, down the hall, and out the side door, their feet barely touching the ground. They didn't stop running until they reached the trees where their horses were hidden. They mounted and rode like the devil himself was on their heels. The journal tucked safely inside Jonas's coat. They had done the impossible. They had walked into the lion's den and stolen its teeth. But as they rode back toward the small, vulnerable ranch under the pale light of dawn, Jonas knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the final battle. Grayley knew someone had been in his house. He knew his safe had been opened. He would tear the whole world apart to get that journal back. He wasn't going to send a notice from the bank this time. He wasn't going to send thugs to throw rocks. He was going to come with fire and lead, and he was going to come now. They arrived back at the ranch as the first rays of sun were spilling over the mountains. There was no time for relief, no time for congratulations. The air was thick with the premonition of violence. Jonas looked at Evelyn, who had been waiting on the porch all night, her face a mask of anxiety. He showed her the journal. "This is it," he said. "This is everything. But he knows it's gone. He's coming." "So we ride," she said, her voice firm. "We take this to the next county, to a U.S. Marshal. We can be gone in an hour." Jonas shook his head. "No. If we run, he'll hunt us forever. And what about this town? What about all the other families in this book? We can't save ourselves and leave them to him. The rot has to be cut out. Here. Now." "How?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "He owns the sheriff. He owns the town." "He doesn't own everyone," Jonas said, a grim look on his face. "Not yet." He turned to Silas. "Your brother will be expecting us to run, or to fortify this place for a siege. We're going to do the one thing he'll never expect. We're going right back into town. We're going to end this in the open in front of everyone." The plan was madness, walking back into a town that hated them, to confront a man who held all the power. But it was brilliant in its audacity. Grayley's power came from the shadows, from whispers and backroom deals. Jonas was going to drag him into the sunlight. He ripped several pages from the journal, the entry about Maria, and the pages detailing the ruin of two of the town's most respected, now destitute families. He handed them to Silas. "Go into town. Go to the general store. The saloon. Nail these to the doors. Let the people see the truth for themselves. Then meet us at the church. Silas looked at the pages, then at Jonas, his face pale with fear. This was the ultimate betrayal of his own blood. But he nodded. He had chosen his side. He rode off, a lonely figure, carrying a message of truth like a lit fuse. Then Jonas turned to Evelyn. I need you to do the hardest thing of all, he said, his voice gentle. I need you to trust me, and I need you to be ready. He handed her the shotgun and a box of shells. When we get to the church, I'm going to face him, but his men will be there. I need you to watch my back. I need you to be the wall he can't get past. She took the gun, her hands steady now. The girl who had arrived barefoot and broken was gone. In her place was a woman who had found something worth fighting for. They hitched up the wagon, a strange procession heading toward a final confrontation. A grizzled rancher with a stolen journal, and a pregnant girl with a shotgun across her lap. They were riding into the heart of a town that had turned its back on them, to face down a monster, armed with nothing but the truth and a desperate, unbreakable courage. The fuse had been lit. The explosion was coming. The town was a hornet's nest. Silas had done his work well. Small crowds were gathered around the doors of the saloon and the general store, reading the pages from Grayle's journal. Murmurs rippled through the street, confusion, anger, disbelief. The truth was a poison, and it was starting to spread through the town's veins. When Jonas's wagon rolled down Main Street, a hush fell over the crowd. People stared, their faces a mixture of fear and dawning curiosity. Jonas pulled the wagon to a stop right in front of the church, its white steeple stark against the blue sky. It was Sunday morning. The pews would be full. Grayle would be there, playing the part of the pious town benefactor. Jonas helped Evelyn down from the wagon. She held the shotgun at her side, not pointing it, but holding it with a grim purpose that no one could mistake. They walked toward the church doors, every eye in town following them. The doors swung open, and there he was. Grayle, standing on the top step, flanked by a half-dozen hired guns. The sheriff was there too, looking pale and nervous, his hand hovering over his pistol. Grayle's face was a mask of pure reptilian rage. He had seen the pages on the doors. He knew what Jonas had. "McCready!" he roared, his voice booming across the street. "You are a dead man! You stole from me! Sheriff, arrest him!" The sheriff took a hesitant step forward, but Jonas held up the journal. "This book belongs to you, Grayle," Jonas called out, his voice clear and steady. "And it tells quite a story. It tells the story of how you drove the Miller family into bankruptcy and bought their land for nothing. It tells how you blackmailed the blacksmith into signing over his deed. And it tells a story about a girl named Maria and a hole dug by an old well." A gasp went through the crowd. The Millers, the blacksmith. These were their neighbors, their friends. Now they understood. "Lies!" Grayle screamed, his composure cracking. "He's a thief and a liar. I want that book." He motioned to his men. "Get it!" The hired guns started to move forward, fanning out, their hands going to their pistols. The townspeople scattered, running for cover. This was it. The street was about to turn into a bloodbath. But then something unexpected happened. Evelyn stepped forward. She stood beside Jonas, her small frame unyielding, and raised the shotgun, aiming it not at Grayle, but at the men advancing on them. "The first one who takes another step," she said, her voice ringing with a strength no one had ever heard from her, "is the first one who dies." The men froze. They were willing to fight for Grayle's money, but they weren't expecting to be shot by a pregnant girl. Her raw courage, her sheer, unexpected defiance threw them off. It gave Jonas the opening he needed. He tossed the journal not to the sheriff, but onto the dusty ground in the middle of the street, halfway between him and Grayle. "It's all in there, Sheriff," Jonas said, his eyes locking with the lawman's. "Everything you need to see him hang. But you have to make a choice. Right now, are you his law, or are you the town's?" The sheriff looked at the journal. He looked at Grayle's furious face. He looked at the armed men. And then he looked at the faces of the townspeople, peering out from doorways and windows, their eyes full of fear, but also a glimmer of hope. He was a weak man, a cowardly man. But in that one moment, he found a spine. He drew his pistol. But he didn't point it at Jonas. He pointed it at Grayley. "Alistair Grayley," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "You're under arrest for murder." For a second there was a stunned silence. Then Grayley laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "You fool! You work for me!" "Not anymore," the sheriff said. That's when all hell broke loose. Grayley lunged for the journal, and his men drew their guns. Shots rang out, echoing off the false fronts of the buildings. Jonas returned fire with the pistol from his belt, taking cover behind the wagon. Evelyn fired the shotgun, the blast tearing a huge chunk out of the church steps and sending two of Grayley's men scrambling for cover. The street was chaos. But then the townspeople fought back. The blacksmith came running out of his shop, wielding a massive hammer. Old Man Miller appeared with a hunting rifle. Doors opened and ordinary people, people who had been afraid for years, came out with whatever they had. They weren't a militia. They were just people who were tired of being scared. They stood with Jonas. They stood with the sheriff. They stood against the man who had choked their town for years. Seeing his power evaporate before his eyes, seeing the people he thought he owned turn on him, Grayley panicked. He made a run for his horse. But Silas was there. He stepped out from the crowd and stood in his brother's path. "It's over, Alistair," he said. Grayley looked at his younger brother with eyes full of hate. He raised his pistol to fire, but before he could, a single shot rang out from the church steps. It wasn't Jonas. It wasn't the sheriff. It was Evelyn. The pistol flew from Grayley's hand as the buckshot tore into his shoulder. He screamed and collapsed in the dirt, clutching his arm, defeated. Not by a gunslinger, but by the woman he had tried to break. The fight was over. The remaining hired guns surrendered, their employer writhing in the dust. The town was quiet for a moment, the air smelling of gun smoke and freedom. Then a cheer went up. One by one, the townspeople came out, surrounding Jonas and Evelyn, their faces filled with gratitude and awe. They had their town back. Justice hadn't come from a lawman in a faraway city. It had come from a quiet rancher, a broken girl, and a town that finally found its courage. A year later, the sun beat down on the McCready Ranch. But it wasn't the same place. The main cabin was bigger, with a new room built onto the side. The fences were strong, the garden was thriving, and the sound of a baby's laughter drifted on the afternoon breeze. Jonas sat on the porch, rocking a small cradle with his boot. Inside was a little boy with a shock of blonde hair and his mother's determined eyes. Evelyn came out and sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. The peace they had fought for was all around them. The town had healed. Grayley was serving a life sentence in the territorial prison, his land sold off to the families he had ruined. Silas had taken over what was left of his family's holdings, running it with a fairness and humility his brother never knew. The world wasn't perfect. There were still bad men, and there were still hard times. But here, on this small patch of land, they had built something good. A home, a family, a future. Jonas looked at Evelyn, and at the sleeping child who carried none of the darkness of his conception, only the light of the love he was raised in. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he had finally gotten it right. He had protected what mattered. He had stood his ground. He had made a family out of the broken pieces of their lives. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in fighting, but in building. It's in the choice to protect the vulnerable, to stand up to the powerful, and to love what others have thrown away. This story is a testament to that. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of places, a single act of courage can be the spark that lights up the world. If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel something, don't let that feeling fade. Hit that like button and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories that matter. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the quietest people often have the strongest hearts. Thank you for listening.